Good.
Donne-moi 10 secondes qui part. You're on.
Good morning, everyone. My name is David Ainsworth. I'm Head of Communications at the United Nations Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity. Welcome to this press briefing for the 24th of June 2022. We're about 2/3 of the way through this fourth meeting of the Open-Ended Working Group on the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Let me give you first a little update from things yesterday and talk about what's going to be happening over the course of today. So yesterday we had 5 of the 6 contact groups meeting. Contact group 1, which was dealing with goals C and D of the framework, met. They spent a lot of time defining the term, the means of implementation, what that would mean in the context of these goals. And a big part of the discussion was the relationship of digital sequence information with goal C as well. As you know, digital sequence information is a new issue under the convention. It's something crucial for these talks. It's the matter of digital information that relates to genetic resources. The discussions here are to what extent do the existing tools of the convention, such as the Nagoya Protocol and access to benefit sharing, can be used to address digital sequence information. Because remember, under the Nagoya Protocol, there are genetic resources and a whole set of terms that relate to their use. Because digital sequence information isn't physical genetic resources, there's a question of how it can relate. At the same time, it does represent genetic resources. So contact group 1 is looking at that relationship under the context of goal C. Contact group 2 also met, and friends of the co-leads met to look at definitions, and definitions related to the area descriptions for target 3. Under the proposed framework, target 3 deals with the protection of land and sea areas. So that's about the so-called expansion of areas. A phrase that's typically used is 30% of land and sea by the year 2030. But they need to look at what are those definitions of those area descriptions. There's no consensus yet on the term, but they're looking at that. In the evening, they looked at target 8, which relates to climate change. That discussion was particularly rich. One thing that was not open was the discussion of the definition of nature-based solutions versus ecosystem-based approaches. Now, again, under the convention for climate change, there's the term known as ecosystem-based approaches. This is mitigation or adaptation of climate change. This refers to the idea of doing ecosystem management, landscape management tactics that will be used to help mitigate and adapt to climate change. Planting forests, management of wetlands, a whole variety of different ecosystems. That's the term ecosystem-based approaches under the convention. However, another term has emerged, which is called nature-based solutions. They generally refer to the same things, but under the convention process, there's no consensus on whether you should use which term or the other, so that discussion has yet to come. But I mention it because it is a crucial part for definitions under this area as well. Contact group 2 also moved on to look to target 1, which is about overall protection of species. And they had a small group come together to take the text that came out of Geneva and try to rationalize it, because that text is quite big. The fact is as a result of their work, they added a lot more bracketed text, but it does more rationalized, and we'll come back to that over the course of today. Contact group 3 met, and they had a friends of the chair for target 13. Target 13 of the framework deals with access and benefit sharing, so it does deal with the Nagoya Protocol specifically. There's a small group that included, I don't think I have all the list of countries, but it included the Republic of Korea, Japan, Argentina, Malawi, Switzerland, and Europe. And so they're looking at this target 13 in its relationship. Now, there are 2 different versions of the target that's being discussed right now, something called 13 and 13 ter. So if you go back to the documents on the page and look at that Geneva text that came in from the meeting there, you'll see what they are. So they were looking at those versions. No resolution yet. Let's see, today the contact group is going to pick up on the question of target 9 and then targets 10 to 12, which have to do with sustainable use and some agricultural questions as well. Contact group 4 yesterday met. They looked at target 18, which deals with subsidies. As you know, under this target, there's a proposal to redirect a large sum of subsidies that are currently used for unsustainable practices and redirect them towards biodiversity positive practices. What are these subsidies? So these may be subsidies, for example, fuel subsidies to fishing fleets, subsidies that promote a certain level of fisheries catching, subsidies that promote level or types of agricultural practices which are harmful to biodiversity. So the idea is to try to redirect those. The initial number was $500 billion. That's under discussion. So contact group 4 will look at that more, that discussion on target 18. The group also talks about 19.1, which is financial resources, and that's this question of mobilizing additional resources. The figure that we started with was $200 million a year. And the group also looked at target 19.2 in capacity building. And this is where we had our first real victory of the conference, which is the text for target 19.2 is clean. There is a consensus on the text with no brackets. So we have the first clean text. Now, mind you, given that we've got 22 different targets, that only represents 4% of the targets. A little ways to go. So we'll talk about that later. Contact Group 5 on DSI did not meet yesterday. They'll be meeting over the course of today. Contact Group 6 met on Section D, which is the theory of change for the framework. Those of you who've seen the framework, that's that graphic that looks at how the framework deals with protecting nature, addressing people's needs, and the means of implementation. So the group looked at the theory of change, and it was decided that that graphic needs to be revised, given the notes from the discussions. So South Africa is apparently working on a version of redoing that graphic. It's going to be hard, apparently, to do this for a non-paper. There's some question how that can be sketched out. So we'll see how that works. So it's possible that we'll have a textual representation of the new graphic, but we may not have a new graphic until further down the process. So we'll take a look later on. Contact Group 6 also discussed the 2030 mission for this, because remember, we've got the overall vision that takes us for 2030, but there's a mission there's the overall vision that takes us to 2050, but there's also this 2030 mission that has to be covered. Now, unfortunately, they started with a version and they ended up with 5 different versions now in their hands. So that's a little bit complex. Nevertheless, there seem to be 2 main approaches there under which there's convergence, and we'll know more about that later on. So today, just letting you know, because we're getting on, we started on Tuesday, today's Friday, after today we've got Saturday and Sunday to wrap things up. So we're getting pretty close. So first of all, Contacts Group 3 and 1 will meet this morning to cover their variety of issues. At lunchtime, there will be an info session on the early action grants that are being put forward by the Global Environment Facility. And I would encourage anybody to follow these. So the Global Environment Facility, in collaboration with UNEP and UNDP, has put together these early action grants. And what they mean is countries can get several $100,000 each to begin to prepare themselves for implementing the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework even before it's adopted. This is a really welcome development because typically with many countries, getting financing from the institutions such as the GEF or UNDP takes a long time. And in fact, that was one of the problems with the Aichi biodiversity targets is there's a gap and a lag. These early action grants help eliminate this lag. So that information session is going to cover and look at that. There'll also be a Friends of the Chair on Target 19 on financial resources. That will also be at lunchtime as well. This afternoon will be plenary. Now, it's an important plenary because a couple of matters. Number one, they will have their first reading of the COP decision that deals with the post-2020 framework. So remember, COP has to approve the framework, but it's also got a whole chapeau decision that's got to be dealt with, and they'll read that. But perhaps more interesting is there'll be a stock taking. The co-chairs, Basil Van Haver and Francis Oswald, will present the status of all the different negotiations and targets of where they're at. So we'll take a look, see where we're at, talk about what's going well in the process, what needs to be further advanced, and what the plans are for the next few days. I've seen the briefing in the Bureau. They've got a few more items to adjust to it, which is why I can't report it to you yet, but that'll be the afternoon plenary. That's important. That will determine how delegates will work over the next 2 days, and it will also determine what we do between now right up to COP as far as the framework goes as well. Also tonight, there'll be a Friends of the Chair on DSI, so that Contact Group 5 will have the Friends of the Chair area of DSI, and then Contract Group 4 will meet to talk about targets 14 to 17, and then also 19.1, which is the financial resources mechanism. So we'll take a look at that. We're coming near the end now. I mean, there'll be negotiations all today, on Saturday, and the hope is that we can probably bring things back to the plenary. What I can say in general, without preempting the reports of the co-chairs, is that progress is slow over the course of the meeting. It's very, very clear. What delegates are looking at are trying to imagine different modes or ways of having these discussions over the next 2 days that can help resolve as many of these outstanding issues. Again, the important part is coming out of this meeting, we need to have the text as rational as possible, as few brackets as possible, and the highest level of consent so that governments have very little work to do and move forward on the course of The other thing to report as far as press conferences, the Women's Caucus will have a press conference here at 11 a.m. this morning. They want to talk about progress on the target related to gender. So they'll be here to talk about where the process is going, the parts that they think are positive, and other areas where they need to advance. So they'll be here at 11 o'clock in this particular room. That's what I've got for you. I can take any questions from the floor. If there's anything, I shall take a look online if there are any questions as well. Good. Okay. Questions from the floor? Nothing? I was absolutely clear. Pretty good question. Thanks.
Hello. So I think I don't need to give my introduction.
That's
Since,
fine.
yeah, I am asking question every day.
Yeah.
So you said that in one of the working group, in one of the contact group meetings, so they began with one single version of the target, and now they have 5 different versions. So what happens if multiple number of targets are just multiplied in terms of the numbers of versions by the end of this meeting? Thank you.
Yeah, no, exactly. So when I was talking specifically, I was saying that they had a discussion of the mission. So that's the area where the 2030 mission, which is what people should be seeking to achieve in the next 10 years, that's where they ended up with multiple approaches. So when they come to the COP, you have to come down with one approach finally. Like the governments will only adopt, every element of this framework must be very, very clear in this case. So this is where we have to look at generating consensus. So if they've had 5 different versions, we have to identify which ones there's the most support for. From understanding, this group is never, even though there are 5 versions around, there are really 2 main approaches. And so this is where negotiation and discussions go, where parties try to find points of convergence, where they can identify which one is the most popular, and then what adjustments need to be made to make that acceptable to all parties. Under the CBD process, because we don't vote on these things, because we generate consensus, on one hand it helps eliminate divisions, but it's very, very difficult because nothing is agreed until everything is agreed in that case. And so consensus can be very, very challenging because you have to make sure that you have the elements that everyone can agree for. Some people argue that that generates texts that aren't, don't have the maximum impact, but at the same time it generates texts that everyone can agree on and everyone can act on, whereas voting can be somewhat divisive in this particular case. That's why they've got a lot of work to do. They've got to find out the right way to come to those consensus so that when we close this meeting on Sunday, probably very, very late, that we've got as much done as possible. Okay, thanks very much. We've got some more questions. Go ahead, please.
Hi, you just mentioned that Contact Group 2 was working on target number 1 yesterday, and you mentioned that they added more brackets, and but the text has been rationalized. Could you elaborate on what rationalized means here?
Yeah, rationalized. So I've got to be careful here because what I'm doing is I'm repeating a term that was used in the bureau meeting by one of the co-leads, pardon me. So rationalize. When you rationalize the text, that's where you would look at all the different competing elements that are added, and you would say, okay, where can they be combined? Where can we stream them? Because what's happened with some of these targets under negotiation or text elements under negotiation is, with the original text, you've got new suggestions added. So you'll have, from one original sentence, you may have 3, 4, 5 new elements added to it, and they're referred in different brackets. The first process in Geneva for many of these things was just to gather opinions. So you can have a text that in fact has 5 opinions that are repetitive. So with rationalization, you identify which elements could possibly be combined, which ones could be eliminated. So in fact, it will take the length of the text and possibly shrink it and make it area, but you could nevertheless still have areas where the delegates say, okay, well, thank you for rationalizing it, but these 3 words here need to be bracketed as well as these in there. So it's a shorter text, but probably with a number of elements that still remain to be discussed. Thank you.
Hi, Monica. You mentioned something on the nature-based solutions that it's being discussed that new nature-based solutions and its conflict with the ecosystem-based approaches. So could you just elaborate a bit more, like what is new that is being discussed now?
Sure. Let's see. So one thing I did mention is that there's a debate that exists, but they didn't tackle that last night. First of all, that's an existing debate, but that group, that contact group, didn't get on it. That's contact group 2. Now, so Nature-based solutions is one phrase that refers to a package of elements that protects biodiversity but also contributes to climate change mitigation and adaptation. But the term that we use under the convention is called ecosystem-based approaches to climate change adaptation and mitigation. So ecosystem-based approaches is a term that the governments here under the CBD have discussed for years. It's been approved by the SBSTA, it's been approved by the COP. And so what it does is it's very technical, it's very specific, and it describes a whole number of land management techniques or restoration techniques or specific interventions that you can do that both protect biodiversity, use it sustainably, possibly restore it, and that have the impact of also do mitigation. So you can store carbon in ecosystems in a better way as a result of this. The term nature-based solutions is a newer term. It's emerged in some other discussions. I know that IUCN refers to it a lot. We've had some other agencies. So what we have here is this new term. Governments under the CBD haven't yet agreed if that term nature-based solutions is synonymous with ecosystem-based approaches or if it's something different. And so that's kind of the debate. The trick is for example, for me as a person who does communications and works with you in the media, nature-based solutions is more accessible to a broader number of people. If you say nature-based solutions, people can say, okay, right, so nature, that's about forests, I guess that's about marshes, wetlands, okay, they can understand it. But it's not as precise. The term nature itself, from a technical and scientific point of view, is not as defined. Whereas ecosystem-based approaches, I think, are something that we under the convention, it's very clear people who do management understand it, but it is not quite as accessible. So we're deciding the difference between those terms. I think the convention will have to come to some sort of decision on whether or not they're synonymous. The only trick is that, certainly under this working group, there's no provision to do the kind of research and debate on that term specifically before the meeting. That's something that our scientific body has to look at. So I suspect the challenge is going to be if the convention wants to accept nature-based solutions, you're going to need a process to evaluate it properly. But they're essentially synonymous, but it's a question of which one is recognized in the convention and which one isn't. But that's an important distinction because when you're doing these terms in the context of the convention and international law and policies, you've got to be very specific. Thanks. Okay. Oh, we have another over here.
Hi, everyone. This is Murad Khan from Pakistan. Can you please tell me how many organizations or countries are taking place here in this contact group meetings that we can mention in our stories? And secondly, is there something that you can share with us on daily basis that what's going on, what's happening, or like a summary in written? So that we can mention it that today these things has happened and these negotiations happened.
Sure, we should write a summary for you. So first of all, on the numbers, I'm going to have to get back to you, and so maybe I'll have to write to you because the numbers have changed. I mean, we had a certain number of countries at the beginning, but actually that reporting wasn't accurate, so I'll have to let you know. So overall, we've got a strong representation of almost all the parties to the convention, but I can't remember the specific number. But with regard to the contact groups, just letting you know that those change in size too. And it's actually interesting. So usually under our process, when we call a contact group, we actually normally talk about a small group of maybe 40, 50 people representing that many number of countries. But here in these meetings, the contact groups are huge. We might have 120 people in a contact group. So that's very, very large indeed. So, which makes it hard to have the discussions. That's one of the reasons they've got to discuss how can we even maybe break the contact groups down into smaller groups as well. Because if you're trying to build a consensus, 120 people trying to agree on something is hard. Instead, sometimes you can put together smaller groups of maybe a dozen people where a single country might represent the interests of a region moving forward. But I apologize, I can't give the specific number of the participants, but I'll get that for you at the end of today, so you can have that. Now, with regard to the written summary of everything here, that's why I give you the briefing, so you guys can take notes, you can ask me questions, things like that, you can take a look. I mean, one of the things, if you want a possible overall summary, is you should be looking at the Earth Negotiations Bulletin. So it's called ENB, if you check on the line. The Earth Negotiations Bulletin does a written summary of activities that are going on over the course of the day. They're much longer, but they can give you a sense of what's happening in this area. Okay. Great. Well, thank you, everybody. Oh, I have another one back. Go right ahead. We've got time.
sorry for another question. But you mentioned that there has been small victory in target 19.2, strengthening the capacity and things like that. Could you explain a bit about that? And also, there's been talks that all the negotiations are proceeding at a very slow pace. So what could have been a faster or a medium pace? Like what was expected and how it's not getting to the pace that was expected before? Thank you.
Sure, certainly. So target 19.2 deals with the question of capacity building, because a big part of the convention is that it's hoped that countries that don't have the capacity to implement the convention should get means of moving forward. So capacity building is related to resource mobilization, right? So how can we mobilize human financial resources to make sure that countries have got the tools that they need. So we call it a small victory because the text for that is now clean, which is to say that the text has no brackets in it, and what we have there is agreed for by the parties. So that can just be adopted now by the conference of parties when the overall thing is done. That constitutes a victory because that kind of thing where we've got all the text agreed, no brackets is what we want for everything else. Now, with regard to the slow pace, what we're expecting, well, the hope here was that we could have the majority of the elements of the global framework really without those kind of brackets. That's what we hoped for as well. So we'll have to see. And when you see the stock taking this afternoon, you'll see the co-chairs have to report. And the report is going to say things like, right, here are the parts that we know we can agree here in Nairobi. Here are the parts that we know we won't have a final consensus, but I think they'll be strong enough to be agreed at a later date. Here are the parts where there's a great deal of work. And so our hope was that at the end of this meeting, we could have a strong enough a text with fewer brackets, so that when we get to the COP, the delegates don't have to do very much work. Because I think, as I mentioned in the previous briefing, when the conference of the party meetings happens, they're not only discussing the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, they have all the other issues of the convention. And so they don't have a great deal of time before them to do those negotiations. I don't know if I give you a numerical number. I know that there's some people said, right, we wanted to have, say, 80% of these things agreed here in Nairobi. That was a pretty ambitious target right there. To see what it is, but I think we hope to have a little more. But we'll see, because with the remaining 2 days, a lot can be done. And my sense after being at the Bureau meeting is that governments are really ready to reconfigure the way they address these topics here in the Nairobi meeting to make progress quite fast. There really is a desire to work together. There's no, the sense of obstruction or dragging feet on this is very, very limited. Most countries want to get this job done. Thanks. That's fine, we got a few minutes, for sure.
So 19th target also talks about the finance and the $200 billion, $500 billion subsidy reduction and $10 billion increase in financing every year. So how does this 19.2 sort of helps or builds up on the 19 target or the finance totally?
I think it's just a way of organizing it, because, so remember, on the question of subsidies, that's target 18. Okay, target 18 is where we're addressing the question of redirection of subsidies, so that's there. Target 19.1 is specifically about the resource mobilization. That's what we're looking at. That's the question of, how much more do we need at the international level, ODA, and then how much do we need at all other levels. So that's good. Now, the reason we call it 19.1 and 19.2 is because capacity building also simply requires resources. So I think they just simply took that and split those targets into those portions so they can look at it. How are they related? Well, you need resources to be with capacity building, right? So you need technical assistance, you need financial transfers to facilitate that, and I think that's how they are related in that regard. Thanks. Okay, great. Well, thank you, everybody. So good luck with your coverage today. And like I said, come back here for 11 a.m. for the press conference, the women's conference. Thanks very much. Have a good day.